When my story is told, it's usually told about my husband. You may know him. He was so in love with me that he rent open the earth to pull me under, asking my father in secret for my hand in marriage. My mother, of course, he knew, would not allow this. When my story is told, you may have heard it told by my mother, goddess of the grain, the goddess of fertility, the goddess of all things on this earth, the goddess who makes great the land and feeds the people. You may have heard my story told from her grief, the grief where she cried and wailed at my abduction, and her sorrow at my loss. Her sorrow that was so great, she set apart a blight on this earth, feeding no one. All the plants shriveled and withered. All the orchards were barren. There was no more grain. The people went hungry. And thus, appealing to the gods, she sought after my release from this abduction. Maybe you've heard her story told, my mother, Demeter. Maybe you've heard my husband's story, Hades. But my story is rarely told from my perspective. My mother is half of the circle above ground. My husband is the other half of the circle below ground, for this one planet we inhabit. But I am the hinge. I am the hinge point between the above and the below. Maybe you have heard in the myth that I was the goddess of springtime, the maiden of spring, and that my great gift was joy, and joy that I brought to everyone. My mother especially cherished my laugh and my joy, and the way that I would awaken the seeds and awaken the flowers and awaken everything so that it might make new life. And it was in fact that seed of joy that was like a lightning bolt, which I inherited from my father, Zeus. That lightning bolt that awakens seeds and awakens life and gets everything fertile and growing again. Maybe you'd heard that about me. Maybe you'd heard about the day where my mother, so concerned for my health and well-being, had me watched by nymphs, and we were at the seashore, and I was playing. But the part of the story you may not have heard was because we gods are more than that. We are elemental beings. We are not bounded by bodies. We are not bounded by linear time. That's a human conception, and that's the way that humans tell our stories, because it is what we know. It's what they know. But that's not how it is for us, where we are both immortal and ever-present. I was the goddess of seeds. I am the goddess of seeds. Where do seeds live? Seeds live underground, in the ground. I lived at that place because as elementals, we dissolve into a kind of vast timelessness. How else can we be everywhere on this planet all at once? So I would dissolve into all of those awaiting seeds and the joy and the rapture of them when they bravely break open their husks and force their tiny, vulnerable tendrils up into the dark earth, and that moment where they break through and see the light of day and all of the sunlight and the color that surrounds the above-ground world of my mother, who then would make rich all of the food, all of the seeds, all of the beings and plants and animals and people. But I lived underground. And there was always a face, a very handsome face, that I would see underground. And I lived with that face as long as I can remember. The eyes always filled with love. And this face would look up at me out of the dark earth as I was dissolved into all the seeds underground. And I have loved that face for as long as I could remember. Always. So that day that gets told so often, when the sea opened and the earth rent a giant chasm, there was a hand outstretched to me. And attached to that hand was that face. That face I knew as well as I knew my own, staring at me, filled with love. No one ever tells you that part of the story. And how my body could only move forward toward his, and toward his awaiting hands, and how our hands laced together, and how in that lacing and that conjoining, suddenly we dissolved into the elemental timelessness that we are also. Our bodies dissolving into suddenly myriads of webs, myriads of life, like mycelium webs that parted as we went down, down, down. It was like a cosmos, like a web, like stones were stars, and there was so much life. There was so much life underground. There was a vast interwebbed intelligence, which I can only describe for you in words that are not sufficient, as brilliant and beautiful and whole. And I felt this profound sense of belonging, that here was this web that connected everything, everywhere, all across the planet. And beautiful things were happening. And my beloved, whose hand I was holding, kept taking me and saying, and then here, and then this, and showing me. And it was like a cosmos appearing before my eyes. There was so much wonder in watching how the dead eat the dead. We call them decomposers, but really, it's the souls of the dead who eat the dead and then make life again, and then make fertile the land again. And they break down everything into tiny elemental pieces, the minerals and the carbon and the sugar and the water. There were vast underground caverns and rivers and watersheds and pulsing rivulets of these mycological webs moving, some of which were phosphorescent and glowing like stars underground. I had never seen anything so beautiful in my entire life. As I said, we gods, we are not bounded by time. What is a day in the life of a stone? In a trillion years? A billion years? What is a day in the life of a fungi? Billions of years have gone by. It's a blink. It's a moment. Time is different underground. So as I was marveling at all of these wonders being shown to me, this vast web that I was a part of, I was so distinctly a part of this web because I was the one who brought the joy, the lightning, ecstasy, the orgasmic moment of conjoining that brought all life. I finally understood where my place was. My mother had dominion over the entire earth. Where was a daughter to go? But suddenly I found my own dominion, my own place. There, my beloved in his hand in mine. Suddenly, I could hear a sound coming from very far away, and it started repeating. And as I listened in a little more closely, I could hear my own name being called again and again and again, and louder and louder. Persephone! 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 She was calling! And suddenly I realized it was my mother, and my mother was calling me, and she was desperate. I had never heard that cadence and tone of despair in her voice ever in my entire life, and suddenly I didn't know what was happening. And I said to Hades, "What has gone on?" And he said, "We've been here for months." And I said, months, but it was just a moment that we met on the seaside. And he had to explain that time was different. And we slowly started to reshape, and our bodies began to form again. And suddenly I said, no, I just arrived. The wonders have just been introduced to me. It's not time for me to go yet. And he said, you must. There is something really terrible happening on the surface of the earth right now. And I'm going to take you up very slowly so that you can see. And he took me through a web, a beautiful hyphae, a hair of fungus that had gone into a root system of a tree. And from the tree, suddenly we were transporting water and sugar. And as we looked out from this tree, from the inside out, we could see that there was a blight upon the earth and that there were no leaves on this tree, that there was nothing. Everything was withered and barren. This was not the earth I had left a moment ago. The earth I had left was rife with life and abundance, always. My mother provided, always. What had happened in my absence? My husband said, he wasn't my husband yet, but my husband said, watch, Persephone. And he pulled up all of those elements, deep from within, rising, inside the tree. And suddenly, in this dark time of winter, leaves began to grow, and fruit began to form and ripen. And it was fat, and it was red, and it was heavy. And suddenly I was inside the fruit itself. And I could feel these jewel-like seeds filled with the most delicious juice. And I said, I wish I could taste that just for a moment. I have a magical husband. Suddenly, 6 seeds appeared in my hand. And as I put them into my mouth and their juice exploded open, he kissed me. He kissed me with that taste of pomegranate orchestrally exploding in my mouth, my first kiss ever of my most beloved, and this commingling of pomegranate sweet and tart and kiss and warm and soft. And I was melting into him, and then suddenly Hermes was in my ear and the wind was blowing, and suddenly I was with Hermes, and suddenly I was rising upward, and my head was spinning, and I didn't know, was it from the juice? Was it from the kiss? Why am I rising? Why am I rising? Why am I still moving past the mycelium? Why is it still rising and falling away as I move? And why? Then my mother, she was so sad, so distraught. And I had such a confluence of feelings, and I didn't know what I could do, because there she was. And a second ago, I had kissed the man that I loved more than I'd ever loved anything. And then suddenly, she's in my arms, and we're continuing to rise, and continuing to rise, and continuing to rise. And then suddenly, I'm in the house of my father, and I'm in the heavens. And my mother is there, and she's weeping, and everyone I know is there, all my aunties and uncles and cousins and nymphs, and everyone who I've ever known, every god, every elemental, is present with me. And my head is still spinning, and my mouth still tastes like pomegranate and first kiss. And suddenly, everyone is asking. Everyone is shouting at me. Did you eat the food of the dead? Did you eat the food of the dead? Persephone, did you eat the food of the dead? Did you eat the food of the dead? And my mind is spinning, and I'm thinking, no, I did not eat the dead eat the dead. They decompose the dead, and then they turn it into life again. I wasn't eating that. I was watching. I was one with that. How do I even explain that it's not like eating? What are they talking about? And suddenly, my father, with the ability to cut through a situation like a lightning bolt, he's no stranger to love. He'd been privy to my husband's desire for me. He knew that my mother would never allow me to be the queen of the underworld, the queen of the dead. but he knew that we had always loved each other. So with a glint of lightning in his eye, he said, "Persephone, what are those seeds in your mouth?" I said, "Yes, I did. I did eat food there in the underworld. I had 6 pomegranate seeds, and I was elated. It was like telling my beloved family about my first kiss, that first moment. And suddenly heads were shaking, and my mother started wailing and clawing her hair and beating her breast, and I was so confused. I didn't know what I should do with this situation. Again, my father's ability to, like lightning, cut through a situation, said, "Persephone, you have eaten the food of the dead. Therefore, you must return to the underworld." My heart leaping. I'm not showing it on my face. I can't wait to go back. But my mother weeping and crying. And he said, "Demeter, I see that there is a blight upon the earth because your sorrow has extended out, and our people must eat. And there must be abundance and fertility on the land again. And I know that your fertility and your generosity is linked to your own happiness and well-being. And without your daughter, you will not have that. So I will make a concession. Half of the year, you will live above ground with your mother. The other half of the year, you will go down and be with your beloved." And thus I became that hinge of what is called season. And over the years, it became like breathing. As I said, we are immortal elementals. Time is a moment to us. The seasons moved, and it became like breath, where I would descend on my out-breath. And on my next inhale, I'd already be ascending again. And above ground, and then again, descend down, and again, up onto the earth. And during this time, we all found a homeostasis and a synthesis with one another. My mother learned how to make vegetables and fruits that would bloom in the winter below ground and that would feed the people. And my husband learned how to communicate with the mycelium and ask it once in a while to provide fruiting bodies for us that we call mushrooms after the rain, to remind me of his love as I was above ground. These mushrooms became an amazing ability and synthesis on this earth to decompose all kinds of things, to be both medicinal and medicinal to the landscape itself. And some were even medicinal to the human psyche and would be medicine from within, going in to help reconnect people to the ever-abundant web of intelligent beauty that lives everywhere, above and below ground. And for many, many decades, many centuries, many millennia, there was balance. The above-ground life of my mother, and then she got time to rest and rejuvenate herself. And then my husband's work and mine would begin, decomposing the dead, the old, and transforming it back into fertile elements to feed. And then I would come in spring, and the awakening, the orgasmic conjoining that would happen again. And everyone had rest, and everyone had enough. The last 200 years have felt like a blink to us. But I ask you now, what is the story that you are telling? Why do I come back month after month, year after year to see a poisoned and diseased mother and a very sad and burdened husband? I ask myself again and again, which is why I stand before you tonight. What is the story that we are telling? What is the story that is being told? And as I investigated, I would watch the natural cycle of season, that the below and above, the whole circle. Suddenly, it's only above. It's only produce. It's only consume. 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 Eat, eat, eat. And then suddenly, all of you were making metal bodies with gears that would produce and produce and produce and produce things over and over and over, things that sometimes were only used one time. And then suddenly they were put into the ground, but not in any way that my husband could help decompose, because there was plastic around it, or metal. Not even the bodies of humans anymore were put in the ground in a way that could go back into the earth. A profound imbalance. And I wonder if maybe the hunger that we are watching is because everyone is so tired. Do you need to eat and consume because there is never a break? There is never stop. There is never enough. So I ask you now, what is the story of enough? What is that story? Because we don't know what to do. We gods, we elementals, we do not know what to do. So I've come to you with this story, not knowing how it ends. But I give it to you. I give it to you like a pomegranate in winter. I give it to you that its fruit might be rife with hope and juice and sweetness and profound, miraculous ability to change. And I ask you, what will you do with the story of enough? So I'd like to thank the myth of Persephone. I'd like to thank the oral tradition that brought us to it. I'd like to thank all the tellers who have told that story time and time again. I'd like to thank Sophie Strand and her work at the edges of mycelium and mythology and ecology. And now that I have given you that story, my question to you is, what will you do with that story?